Hey, this is Josh for Retooled.net, and in this video we're going to talk about the Premiere Pro CC 2014 IBC update. Now there are a number of huge things that we need to talk about here and a bunch of new features, the first of which is the updated and redesigned user interface. Now you'll notice a lot of changes. First of all, you'll notice that the buttons are a lot flatter. There's no sort of outline behind them or no gradients. Everything's a bit flatter, a bit more similar to iOS or Windows 8. Things are a lot simpler overall. They've also functionally changed a few things. For instance, if you look, the timeline panel still has these little X's next to it to close, but a lot of the other windows don't because people were clicking those by accident. So instead of clicking on those little X's, you click on this button here and have to go to Close Panel. Now it's a bit of an extra step, the hassle. The other thing that's changed is instead of there being two sort of drop downs in the windows, there used to be sort of the little triangle drop down in the top right corner. In addition to this wrench, things have been combined. So you have this little menu for closing and undocking your panels, but most of your settings have moved into the settings wrench panel here, and you'll see that you have a whole list of settings there. I think it's a little bit cleaner because it's easier to know where to go to find your settings. The other thing that's changed is it's been made a little bit clearer what you have selected. So if I have an in and an out here, you can see these tracks get a nice outline because they're active tracks within an in and an out. So if I hit delete, for instance, those are the tracks where things will be deleted. Now I don't have things on these other tracks, but for instance V4 wasn't active, so it wasn't selected. Moving on, we have a nice organizational feature of search bins, and let me show you a quick demo of how this works. Now it'll work on all of your metadata fields, but let's just say I type in the word stove. Now I have one clip where if we look at it, I have typed in a description of stove. But instead of having to constantly search for my stove clips, I can click on this button to create a new search bin from the query. And you'll see I have a new search bin called stove, and that's just creating a reference to any clips I have in my project that have either the name or the metadata that has the word stove in it. So I'm just going to bring in this clip right here, and if I come down and I just type in the description stove here, and I'll show you the search bin at the same time, I'll enter stove in the description, and it'll take a second, but when I scroll down, you'll notice that clip is now in the search bin as well. So this could be things like names, it could be things like descriptions, but it can also be things like .mov or codecs like H.264 files. It could even be things like 23976 for the frame rate. So if I type that in, you'll see all my clips. If I look at the frame rate column that are 23976 will show up, and I can make a search bin out of that, and all of these things will pop into it, including my sequences or adjustment layers as well. So it's a nice organizational feature that's kind of similar to some things you've had in Avid for a while, but for people not used to it, it is a really nice way to keep things organized. Another quick thing I want to show you about the search bins is you can actually change your search bin terms by right-clicking and hitting Edit Search Bin. So you could say all metadata contains 23976 and video codec is H.264, for instance, and it'll change the contents of your search bin. So I'm not going to actually do that right now, but it's just the type of thing that you can do. You can also do OR searches in addition to END searches. I'm going to delete those two search bins for now and move on to the third feature, which is another organizational feature, and that is the Find in Timeline dialog. And if I click on my timeline and I hit Command F, you can see I can do search terms. I can do AND or OR searches, and I can set a number of criteria. So I'm going to do anything that contains a marker with the word clip in it, and I'm going to hit Find. And it'll jump to this sequence because if I go to my markers panel, you'll see it says chop sequence clip. Now if you go into the keyboard shortcuts, there's another hidden feature here, which if I type in find, there's a shortcut. Well, I actually added this one, but you can add a shortcut for find next. So I did Option Command F, and let's see what happens. If I hit that, it will find the next thing because you'll see this one is called colander clip. So they both have the word clip in the marker, and that's what I told it to search for. Of course, you could do it based on file names. You could do it based on a ton of different criteria. If you look here, all, name, markers, effects. So if you want to know which clips contain the effect three-way color corrector, you can search for that and then remove that effect from only those clips. It's a nice way to be able to find specific things in your timeline. Now there's also the ability to find all. So if I duplicate one of my clips here and I search for it, let's do searching by the name 846, and I hit find all, it'll actually highlight both of those clips so I could quickly separate them to their own track or do whatever I need to do to quickly isolate them. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the new masking and tracking improvements. Now in 2014 we got the ability to do masking and tracking with elliptical and 4-point polygonal masks, but we've been given a new feature which is really nice. So if I take a look at this clip, I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit and I want to focus on this apple. Let's say I want to change the color of that apple, so I will load up a fast color corrector. Drag that onto my clip, and I'm just going to do something crazy so you guys could see it, but that's great except it's changing the color on everything. So before we had the elliptical, the 4-point polygonal, but now we have the free draw Bezier. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more so I can draw this Bezier really nice. So if I select that, it's basically a pen tool like you're used to from After Effects or Photoshop. So I'm just going to come in here. So I could click and make regular vertices, or I click and drag to actually make Bezier handles. So I'll just come in here and I'm just going to do this really roughly right now. So I have that, and the really cool thing is I could come in and I could come in later. I could still refine my shape just like I would in After Effects. So for instance, let's say I want to make this one a Bezier. I'll just option click and drag it out to smooth that point out. Come in, change these handles, and you'll see I have this little widget here. Now this outer handle is for feathering, so I could feather that out, which doesn't really apply here, but it's a nice control if I need it. And let's say I feather it, but then I need to expand it. There's actually a handle for mask expansion as well, so you'll see how helpful this can really be. And it really starts to shine when you realize that it's fully trackable. So I'm going to zoom back out again, and if I hit play, it's just going to track that mask into my shot, so I don't have to worry about keyframing it or bringing it over to After Effects. I can just simply hit track forward, and if it's a nice rigid shape like this apple is, you'll see if I click off of it, I have a nice apple that has the color change. So it's really helpful to be able to do this quick compositing in your timeline at such a high quality level, and of course that will transfer over to After Effects if you want to refine it in there any further, but in all honesty this is pretty damn good as it is, so I don't know if I would need to. Moving on, the fifth thing I'm going to talk about is the option for label colors to be persistent across the project. So if I come over here, the way it's typically worked is that if I change a label color in my project panel, for instance, it wouldn't change in my timeline. So you'll see I'm going to just change all these clips to make sure I get the ones in my timeline. I'll change it to rows, but in my timeline none of them have changed. So I'm just going to undo that a few times until all those label colors go back. And then I'm going to go over to my project settings, File, Project Settings, General, and I'm going to click on the checkbox that says display the project items name and label color for all instances. Click OK, and now when I right click and I change the label color to rows, you'll notice all the ones in the timeline change as well, and that's really nice because that's kind of what I'm used to as someone who came from Final Cut. And you'll see if I do the reverse, I'll change it to violet, and you'll notice those particular clips change back to violet here as well. Now the same thing applies to names. So if I take this clip and I change it to clip name, you'll see that in my timeline it's now called clip name as well. So it'll just keep that consistency through your project. And the nice thing is once you check that once on a project, that same setting will be persistent across the next project you make. Now you can always change it back if you need to, but it'll stay there just so you don't have to check it every time. The next thing I'm going to talk about is really simple, and that is just adjustable font sizes in your project panel. So for some people this might be kind of small, hard to read. You could just come over here and go to font size, do something like extra large or large, and of course the default is medium, which is the most similar to what it was, but it just makes it a little easier to see on a high resolution monitor your file names. I'm going to change it back to the default of medium, which is kind of where I prefer it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the ability to select multiple markers and move or delete them. So let's say I want to select these two markers. I'm just going to click on one of them and take the second one, and I'm going to hold down Shift and click on that one. So now I can move these two markers in unison, and if I want to delete those two, I could right click and hit clear selected marker, and that will clear only the selected markers. So I got rid of those two while keeping that one. The next thing I want to talk about is timeline view for your source monitor. So let's say you're editing with another sequence. So let's say you have a select sequence of your footage. I'm going to drag this sequence into my source monitor, and I'm going to come over here and check the option that says Open Sequence in Timeline. Now, the best way I prefer to look at this is in sort of the pancake timeline view here. So I'm going to take that and drag it up. And now you'll see, as I come in here, my ins and outs are reflected down here. It has a nice indication of source monitor, showing me that timeline is what's in my source monitor. And I could come in here, set ins and outs, and I could actually see where all my edit points are. And once I'm happy with that, I could come down to my regular sequence, edit it in, and if I hide that other one, you'll see I have my adjustment layer and all the clips that were selected in that timeline. But I knew exactly what I was going to get because I was able to see it in this timeline just the way it would have been. The next thing I'm going to show you is the project manager, and a lot of people have been requesting this feature for a long time. So the project manager, I'm pretty sure, has been stagnant for a while. But one thing that a lot of people have requested was the ability to take your sequence and consolidate it and transcode it to another type of format. Let me show you what I mean. If I come over here to File, Project Manager, I can check what sequence I'm interested in. In this case, it's this one that's already checked. And I'm going to go to Consolidate and Transcode. And what this is going to let me do is actually make a copy of my sequence that maintains all the original clips but sets them all to the same codec. So let's say I want everything to be in a certain archival format, or I want everything to be sort of simpler to play back. So if I was cutting with R3Ds, for instance, and I want to go to ProRes LT, I can check that, tell it I want to match my individual clips. If I check sequence, it's going to match frame rate and frame size for my sequence. So I want to keep the settings from my original clips. So I keep the frame rate in case I have mixed frame rates. I keep the frame size, so if I have a 4K clip, it'll keep that intact. So I'm going to click individual clips, and I'm going to do QuickTime, but you also have MXF and DNX HD settings. And of course, you can make your own presets here as well. So I'm going to go for QuickTime, and I'm going to go for Match Source Apple ProRes LT. Now that would do Apple ProRes LT of all my clips, and I could tell it how many frames of handles I want to give it. So if I go to the options, I could go to exclude unused, which I'm going to do because I don't want any unused clips in there. I also want to include handles, and I could dial up how many frames of handles I want to give that. I could tell it whether I want to convert image sequences to clips, so I'm going to check that. I could also tell it whether I want to rename media files to match clips. So for instance, if I want that clip to be clipname.mov instead of the original file name, I would check that. I want to keep the original file name so there's a record of what it was in case I need to go back. But there's another option in here, which is convert After Effects compositions to clips. So I'm going to check that. If I look at my timeline, there's a .aep here, and I want that to be converted to footage. Now there's one huge caveat here in that this is a After Effects composition that needs an alpha channel to be able to work. So if I were to do this right now, it would actually screw up my timeline. So I would need to use something like ProRes 444 with alpha or a GoPro Cineform with alpha. Ideally, there'd be a way to treat clips with alpha differently than the rest of the clips in your timeline, but maybe that's something they'll add over time. But for now, just know if you have clips that need to maintain alpha, you need a format that supports it. Otherwise, everything's going to come through all wrong. So in this case, I would have to do GoPro Cineform with alpha or make a preset for ProRes 444 with alpha. You could of course tell it where you want it to go, and if I hit calculate, it'll tell me how much disk space it's going to use. Because I limited the handles and changed the codec, it's actually gonna make a smaller project from 2.9 to 517 megs. So I'm not gonna actually do this now, but that's how it would work. Now another huge feature, if I hit cancel here, there's another option called render and replace. Let's say instead of doing the consolidate and transcode on all of my clips, I just want to do it on this After Effects project. So if I come here and I right click, I can come over to this new option called render and replace. Now, anyone who's ever used dynamic link has probably wanted this feature. It's the ability to actually convert the dynamic link into a QuickTime or another file of your choosing that will let you actually just flatten it so it'll play back easier and doesn't have to process everything every time. So if I hit render and replace, you'll notice I have similar options. Of course, I want to match the individual clip to keep the frame rate and frame size the same. And then I have a choice of format, and again, in this case, I would have to do GoPro Cineform with Alpha, and I'll hit OK. I could control where it goes, whether it's next to the original media or a custom file path that I can choose, and how many handles. So I'm going to add a bunch of handles just in case I need to extend this, and I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to let it render. And now you'll notice it's a .mov file. And if I go to play it back, you'll have titles made in After Effects. Now that's really cool because that's been flattened down for me. But what if I want to go back to the dynamic link? Well, the coolest part is I can right click and hit Restore Unrendered. And it remembers the After Effects project that it came from. And you'll notice I'm right back to my AEP. So I could go back to After Effects, make changes, and then just render and replace it yet again to create an updated version. Now, another thing about this is it doesn't only apply to After Effects comps. I could do this on any piece of footage. So let's say I have a piece of footage that came from my iPhone and it's being a little bit hard to play back and I want it to be ProRes. I can select it and right click and hit render and replace on a single clip or any number of clips, and I could tell it I want to use ProRes LT next to the original media and include handles and hit OK, and it'll render those out. And same way I can just go back to the original. So I'll do it on one clip here, render and replace, keep these settings, actually I'll change it to ProRes LT and hit OK. It'll do its rendering. Now I have my new version in my timeline. If I zoom in, it's the rendered version, but I can always go back to the original. So I think there are some really interesting proxy workflows that could come out of this. I just think there needs to be a bit more customization added to it to truly let this work out as a great proxy workflow. Because one thing you need to know is it's only giving you your edited version of your clip. So if I tell it I only want 5 frames of handles on this edited clip, I can't extend it to the length it used to be. To do that, I of course can go to Restore Unrendered, and then I could drag it out for as long as the clip is. But unless I do that, I'm limited by the length that I render and replaced it at and whatever handles I told it to use. Now I'm going to move on to the things that I relegated in my timeline as all of the little things, and I'm not going to go through all of them. And some of them are actually fairly large features, so I'm going to go through them quickly. Now, one little thing that I talked about was the ability to export a still frame and include a frame number. So you'll notice my time code here is at the playhead position of 1505. If I hit export frame, you'll notice I have 0000 1505. Now, if I'm set to frames, that'll carry through as well. I'm at 365 in my frames, and notice I'm on 365 here. So it's just a reference for you as to what frame you actually exported it at. I'm going to go back to timecode. We have alpha premultiplication settings similar to what you'd have in After Effects. Anyone who's familiar with that, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just show you real quick. You go to modify interpret footage, and you could change whether you're choosing it from the file. In this case, that's a straight alpha, or you want to conform it to something else like a pre-multiplied alpha. So I'm going to keep it what it actually is, a straight alpha, and I'm going to hit OK. You can also now display field information and codec information in the project panel. So if I come down to the end here, you'll see I added the video codec and the field order These are progressive at Apple ProRes 422, and of course you could add that by coming up here and going to the metadata display and just searching for video codec and making sure that's checked, and then the same thing for frame rate and making sure that's checked. Another cool thing is multiple marker colors. So if I come to these markers here and I click on them, you'll see I can change that one, and then come over here, hit M again, change that one, and therefore I could customize all of my markers, and I could have a whole system in place as to what each color marker means. Another cool thing is the ability to show your sequence time code in your overlays. So obviously I could see it here and here that I'm at 1610, but if I go to my overlay settings and I check out my settings, you'll see that I have a new option of sequence time code. Hit OK, and you can see I can now see 1610 up there as well. Now the last thing I'm going to talk about is actually a really pretty big change. But the reason I'm not going to call it a big feature is because for me it's not quite big enough. Now what I mean by that is the feature is the ability to open multiple projects, but a big caveat to that is that all but your main project are read-only. So if I come over to the media browser and I'm just going to navigate to a project, and if I go to my project here and double click on it, you'll see it'll actually open up that project, and I could see all of my bins, and I could see all of my sequences as well. So I'll come over here. Now where it gets interesting is that I can actually drag my sequence into the source monitor, and I could fully work with it. And because I have that setting on that said open sequence in timeline, I actually get this source monitor sequence here as well. Now again, it's read only, so if I try to trim it I can't. But I can see sequences. So it's nice in that if you have an assistant who's doing select strings for you or something like that, you can fully work with their sequences, but you can't edit them. Now for me, it's not good enough because I still want to be able to have multiple projects open. When I'm working on commercials, I like to have a different project for each commercial. So I might have 3 commercials for the same client. I want to be able to have all 3 projects open at the same time. So this is a nice step in the right direction, but it's not exactly full multiple project support. Now one nice thing that you can do is I could come over here and create a new media browser panel, and then I could have a whole different project open in that media browser panel. So again, it's nice, but is it perfect? I don't think so. I think it could still use the ability to actually open full-on read-write multiple projects. It's a nice step in the right direction though. So I hope you guys enjoy all the stuff I got to demo here about the IBC update for Premiere Pro CC 2014. Be sure to check out our new product, Color Retooled, which is a set of looks presets for Premiere Pro CC. A ton of easy presets that you can use in Premiere and SpeedGrade CC to quickly edit the look of your clips. Everything from brightness and contrast to vintage effects to things like vignettes that editors can quickly add to their clips and keep working. Also check out Relink Retooled, our conform tool for Premiere and Final Cut that will let you conform to your QuickTime media of different durations and file names than your original media. You can use it with combinations of tape name, file name, and of course you could use partial tape name and file name combined with metadata like timecode and frame rate to help you relink your clips quicker and easier than ever before.